So after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Western Europe followed a very different path from the Byzantines. For most of the post-classical period, Western Europe was on the outside of world history looking in. They were poor. They were cut off from major Eurasian trading routes of the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean. So the period following the collapse of the Roman Empire is often referred to as the Dark Ages, to emphasize that this was a brutal time. Sometimes it's called the Middle Ages or medieval times. The term Middle Ages signifies that it was between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. And the Renaissance literally means rebirth, and that's rebirth of ideas and ways of living from the classical Western societies of Greece and Rome. The concept of Dark Ages and Middle Ages is really exclusively a Western concept, because this is a time when the Western world is lagging behind China and lagging behind the Islamic world in terms of ideas, politics, technology, and innovation. So these were not the Dark Ages for China. We saw last week that the Tang and the Song are considered by some to be a golden age in Chinese history. These weren't the Dark Ages for Islam, and we'll look at that in more detail next week. So with all that said, it was a pretty rough time for Europe. Disease and warfare reduced the population of Europe by 25%. There was a reversion from urban living to rural living. Rome, at the height of its power, was about 1 million people. By the 10th century, it was down to around 10,000 people. Outside of Italy, long-distance trade dried up. Roads fell into disrepair, and money systems, so currency, reverted back to trade and barter economies, and literacy across the board fell into decline. So instead of large empires, a series of regional kingdoms emerged, and these kingdoms were all led by Germanic groups who had all been heavily influenced by Roman culture by the time they came to power. So you had Visigoths in Spain, Franks in France, Angles and Saxons in England, and Lombards in Italy. So Europe was moving away from the Mediterranean and towards the north and towards the west. One obstacle that always stood in the way of political unification of Europe was the geography. So Europe was divided by mountain ranges, forests, and two big islands, Ireland and Britain. On the plus side, Europe did have productive agriculture. It had extensive coastline and rivers that ran into the interior of the continent, and this made trade easier. So instead of large empires, Europe developed a feudal system. And in the feudal system, kings gave land to vassals in exchange for military support. So these vassals were landowners, and serfs farmed their land. The serfs had more rights than slaves. They were able to live with their families. The vassals weren't allowed to throw serfs off their land, and they weren't considered the personal property of the vassals or landowners. But serfs were also bound to their land for their lives. They couldn't up and leave, and they paid heavy taxes to the vassals. So in the really dangerous world, people were willing to sacrifice their personal freedom for protection, for the protection of the landowners. So this feudal system gave a lot of power to the vassals or landowners, and left the central authority, the kings and queens, fairly weak. So Europe was fragmented, and some of the bigger kingdoms tried to create a new Roman Empire. Probably the most famous of these is Charlemagne, who ruled the Carolingian Empire, which is in modern-day France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and also include parts of Italy and Germany. Charlemagne's state was tied closely to the Catholic Church, and in the year 800 on Christmas Day, Charlemagne was crowned as the new Roman Emperor by the Pope. But his kingdom fell apart shortly after he died. After Charlemagne, Otto I of Saxony gathered much of Germany under his control and was subsequently named the Emperor of the new Holy Roman Empire. But really, the Holy Roman Empire was roughly the equivalent of modern-day Germany and never grew much bigger than that. So we know that after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was this enormous void in power in Western Europe, and it was the church that filled the void much more than kings and queens. Catholic missionaries spread out throughout Europe to spread the message of Christianity, and Christianity, for its part, was appealing to local rulers of smaller kingdoms because it offered a link to Roman society, and Roman society was still very prestigious. So the rulers of these small kingdoms, they found it gave them some legitimacy in ruling if they were associated with the Roman Empire. So if you remember when Buddhism spread, rulers and civilizations in Central Asia found prestige and legitimacy by associating with the religion of a great civilization. In the case of Buddhism, it was India, and in the case of Christianity, it was Rome. So in Europe, it was the kings who converted to Christianity first, and then it was the peasants who they were providing military protection for who followed them. So in order to convert Europeans, Christian missionaries had to adapt religious traditions, older religious traditions, that is, to Christian ones. So old temples were converted to churches. Older festivals that honored older gods became Christian holy days. So a good example of this is Christmas Day, December 25th. This was selected as the birthday of Jesus because it was close to the winter solstice, and there were a lot of festivals celebrating the winter solstice, so it represented the coming of more light and the rebirth and the victory of good over evil. So in order for Christianity to take hold, missionaries had to connect it to long-standing beliefs, and this provided people with a degree of continuity, cultural continuity. So by 1100, most Europeans had embraced Christianity, but priests still had to warn people against doing things like worshipping trees and rivers and mountains. And for a lot of Europeans, ancient gods and monsters, trolls, evil spirits still roamed the earth. By the year 1000, things were looking up for Europe. So between the years 500 and 1000, Europe was basically subject to invasions from all directions. But by the year 1000, things calmed down quite a bit. A lot of the invaders had been absorbed into European society. The climate also got a lot better, so there's a period of warming that began around the year 750, and this led to more plentiful crops across Europe. So you'll sometimes hear of the time period around 1000 to the 1300s as the High Middle Ages. It's still the Middle Ages because we're between the Classics and the Renaissance, but things were getting better for Europeans. The population of Western Europe rose from about 35 million in the year 1000 to 80 million by the year 1340. And to feed the population, forests were cleared to make way for more farmland. So the period was peaceful compared to the early Middle Ages, and this peace allowed long-distance trade to start up again. So European cities started to grow, and the self-sufficient communities started to decline. And in the High Middle Ages, it's when we see the emergence of the northern Italian towns that would play a major role in the upcoming Renaissance, places like Florence and Genoa and Venice. And these places became wealthy by trading with the more established civilizations of Islam and the Byzantine Empire. So here we have a chart that shows urban population around the year 1300s. You can see London had about 40,000 people, Paris had about 80,000 people, Venice 150,000. So these are still smaller than other population centers around the world. Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, had about 200,000 people at this time. Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, had 500,000 people. Cordoba, which was in Muslim Spain, had another 500,000 people. And Guangzhou, the capital of Song China, had around 1 million. So while Western Europe was on the rise in the High Middle Ages, the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, was declining. The Byzantines were in close proximity to the Islamic empires, who had become the superpower in the region. Now, by the 13th and 14th centuries, Western Europe was trading with China and India and the Islamic world, but their hearts were set on more than trade. They wanted to expand and grow politically. For Catholic Europeans, the biggest prize was recapturing the Holy Land from Islam. This led to a series of wars that we call the Crusades. So Crusades were blessed by the Pope, but they weren't organized by any one political state. The church offered crusaders absolution from their sins, relief from debt, if they swore a vow to join the cause, to spread Christianity, and recapture the places associated with the life of Jesus from Muslims. So, when understanding the Crusades, there's certainly economic motives for expansion, but they were more than anything else about religion. They were religious wars, and all evidence points to crusaders being particularly brutal as they waged these religious wars. So during the Crusades, crusaders killed lots of Jews, lots of Muslims, and even other Christians. So the crusaders passed through the land of the Byzantine Empire on the way to the Holy Land and basically took over the city. They ended up ruling Constantinople for 50 years. The Crusaders were able to establish a number of kingdoms in the Middle East, but all of these were lost back to Muslims by the year 1300. And in actuality, the Crusades didn't have that much of an initial impact on the Muslim world. The Crusaders came, did a lot of damage, but ultimately they weren't powerful enough to stay, and they were defeated and fought off. Muslims would later be ravaged by the Mongol invasions, which had a much greater impact. So for a long time in the Muslim world, the Crusades were basically forgotten about. After the Christian Crusaders, they faced the Mongol invasions, which had a greater immediate impact on them. So it wasn't until later, as late as the late 19th century, when European imperialism started having a negative impact on Islam, that the memories of the Crusades were revived and brought back. So that's not to say that there weren't long-term impacts of the Crusades. One of the big impacts was that it worsened the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. So the Crusaders passed through Constantinople, passed through the Byzantine Empire, and did a lot of damage, killed a lot of people on their way to the Holy Land. It worsened relationships between Catholics and Jews. Crusaders killed a lot of Jews, and there was anti-Semitism at that time. Catholics blamed Jews for the death of Jesus. So this just exacerbated the tensions between the two. And obviously it worsened relationships between Christianity and Islam. So it was really the first religious war between Christianity and Islam. So Western Europeans had the vision of expanding and building a Christian empire, but the other Eurasian powers at the time were too powerful and they fought them off. This didn't stop the desire for Christian expansion, and when Europeans crossed the Atlantic and arrived in America just a couple hundred years later, we'd see a continuation of the crusading tradition. So this ends episode 9, The Emergence of Christian Europe.